Hello, my name is Alexis Higgins, and I plan to provide more information to new parents on the media violence hypothesis, which was first introduced by psychologist Albert Bandura. First off, I want to start with the basic definition of aggression, which is typically defined as behavior intended to harm someone who doesn't want to be harmed or involved in this behavior. Another definition that's important is violence. So violence is an extreme form of aggression, and it obviously includes the intention to harm another individual, but it is just a lot more intensified than typical aggressive behavior. And the last definition I want to go over is that of the media violence hypothesis. It's a hypothesis in which individuals who view or take part in violent media may be at an increased risk for aggression, and this was first looked at by Albert Bandura, as I already said, and he looked at this in children. Media is becoming increasingly popular and comes in many different forms. Some of these have been researched by psychologists in relation to the media violence hypothesis, which are things like television, movies, newspapers, and video games. Too much exposure in children has been found to be correlated with aggressive behaviors, thoughts, actions, and verbally in both the short term and the long term. According to some psychologists like Anderson and Berkowitz, other effects can also include physical aggression, which include things like kicking, punching, and fighting. And another issue that comes up with this is the lack of motivation in children when learning, which can be with things like observational learning and other more hands-on approaches to learning. So essentially a child can pick and choose when they want to be engaged. And lastly, desensitization is another issue, which means that emotions are really irrelevant, which we can see with this picture that I chose, because this is talking about how this person no longer has any feelings or emotions towards the violent act that they just committed. Looping back to the short-term and long-term effects that I briefly touched on, researchers have found that children are more likely to be influenced in the long term, whereas adults are more likely to be influenced in the short term in terms of aggression. A lot of this can be attributed to observational learning, which I mentioned earlier. This is essentially when behaviors are learned from watching somebody else take part in the said behavior. Behaviors are typically learned and are not pre-existing. Another factor is priming, which is essentially saying that the more we're exposed to something, the more likely we are to end up forming thoughts and ideas about the stimulus that we are being repeatedly exposed to. Priming can affect both children and adults, but it does show up differently because adults have been more exposed to different stimuli, while children are still very impressionable and have a lot to learn. As we can see by these brains, the maturity level differs a lot. And as I previously mentioned, media is becoming increasingly popular in households. One researcher actually looked into the statistics of how much violence is in the media and found that 60% of films and shows include these different violence acts. And additionally, video games are also included in this idea of violence in the media, and it has been even more and more popular. And in addition, gaming systems are becoming more popular in households, especially with families. Which brings me to my point that different forms of media may need to have censorship in the home because children may be influenced negatively by this violent media, or it may be too early for them to be exposed. As I've already mentioned, the effects in children are a lot more serious than those in adults. Adults and children differ a lot overall, so it makes sense that there are all of these differences. And obviously, there are other influences over this, like with the environment, and also the issue is that with these different influences, we need to be able to reduce the possible aggression, which can help a better future. Most parents do want to nurture their children and want them to have a good future, want them to be involved in learning, want them to have these different emotions. Overall, the happiness and well-being of a child is what most parents want and strive for. Thus, being educated on these different risk factors and exposure children might have to inappropriate content can possibly lead to a better future and which is why parents need to know about the media violence hypothesis. Thank you.